page 138. How exactly then, in theoretical terms, does queer theory differ from lesbian feminism? The answer is that, like many other current critical approaches, lesbian/gay studies within this queer theory ambit have drawn particularly on post-structuralist work of the 1980s. One of the main points of post-structuralism was to deconstruct binary oppositions like that between speech and writing, for instance, showing firstly that the distinction between paired opposites is not absolute, since each term in the pairing can only be understood and defined in terms of the other, and secondly that it is possible to reverse the hierarchy within such pairs and so privilege the second term rather than the first. See chapter 3, pages 71-72. Hence, in lesbian-gay studies, the pair heterosexual/homosexual is deconstructed in this way. The opposition within this pair is seen firstly as inherently unstable. As Diana Fuss, FUSS, puts it, in the introduction to Inside/Outside Lesbian Theories, Gay Theories, much current work in the field aims, quote, to call into question the stability and ineradicability of the hetero/homo hierarchy, unquote, page 1. In an essay which we might take as a practical example of how this dichotomy can be deconstructed, Richard Meyer, Meyer, writes in the same volume about the film star Rock Hudson, once the screen epitome of attractive heterosexual masculinity. In fact, Hudson was gay, but while initially shocking to some, page 139, this is less disturbing of categories than the sense that the very qualities which made him image attractive to women were related to his homosexuality. For, quote, Hudson promised straight women a place of sexual safety he would acquiesce to domesticity without insisting on male domination, unquote, Diana Fuss, p. 282. Para. Likewise, straight male viewers had been relieved, quote, to find a role model who did not require the exhaustive work of machismo to measure up to its masculinity, unquote, page 282. Deconstructing the hetero-homo dichotomy in this way has radical implications, since all such distinctions are constructed in the same way, so that to challenge this one is to challenge all the others too. Para. This anti-essentialism in relation to sexual identity is taken further by other critics. Judith Butler, a prominent contributor to Inside Outside, points out in her essay that identity categories like gay and straight, quote, tend to be instruments of regulatory regimes, comma, whether as the normalizing categories of oppressive structures or as the rallying points for liberty of that very oppression, pages 14-15. Hence, it might be argued, she says, that the concept of homosexuality is itself part of homophobic, that is anti-gay discourse, and indeed the term homosexual is a medical legal one, first used in 1869 in Germany and preceding the invention of the corresponding term heterosexual by 11 years. In this sense, heterosexuality one only comes into being as a consequence of the crystallization of the notion of homosexuality. Thus, lesbianism, say, is not a stable, essential identity, so that in her words, quote, identity can become a site of contest and revision, unquote, page 19. Para. Taking this further, she argues that all identities, including gender identities, are, quote, a kind of impersonation and approximation, ... a kind of imitation for which there is no original, unquote, page 21. This opens the way to a, quote, postmodernist, unquote, notion of identity as a constant switching among a range of different roles and positions drawn from a kind of limitless data bank of potentialities. Further, what is called into question here is the distinction between the naturally given normative self of heterosexuality and the rejected other of homosexuality. The other in these formulations is as much something within us as beyond us, and self and other are always implicated in each other in the root sense of this word, which means to be intertwined or folded into each other. As basic psychology shows, page 140, what is identified as the external other is usually part of the self which is rejected and hence projected outwards. Another critic who argues the fluidity of identity, including sexual identity, is Eve Kosofsky, Kosofsky, Sedgwick, Sedgwick, in her highly influential Epistemology of the Closet. Sedgwick considers how coming out of the closet, openly revealing one's gay or lesbian sexual orientation, is not a single absolute act. Gayness may be openly declared in family and friends, not so comprehensively to employers and colleagues, and perhaps not at all to, say, banks or insurance companies. Hence, being in or out is not a simple dichotomy or a once and for all event. Degrees of concealment and openness coexist in the same lives. Nor will sexual orientation alone usually make a person a complete outsider and therefore innocent of all patriarchal or exploitative taint. A gay person may be a comfortably tenured academic, very much a privileged insider in the eyes of, say, a factory worker, gay or not in a small town. Sedgwick's point then concerns the way subject identity is necessarily a complex mixture of chosen allegiances, social position and professional roles rather than a fixed inner essence. The consequences of this kind of argument are far-reaching both for politics and for literary criticism. Let's consider the political consequences first. Drawing upon a post-structuralist reading of Saussure, we show that such apparently elemental categories as heterosexual and homosexual do not designate fixed essences at all. They are merely part of a structure of differences without fixed terms, like Saussurean signifiers, see chapter 2. We construct instead an anti-essentialist postmodernist concept of identity as a series of masks, roles, and potentialities, a kind of amalgam of everything which is provisional, contingent, and improvisatory. The political consequence is that when we claim the gayness or blackness is merely a shifting signifier, not a fixed entity, then it becomes difficult to imagine how an effective political campaign could be mounted on its behalf. For in the name of anti-essentialism we have removed these bottom-line concepts on which all forms of, quote, identity politics, unquote, depend. By identity politics we mean those which campaign for and by groups disadvantaged by some aspect of their identity, such as their gender, their race or their sexual orientation. The opposition of identity politics would be class politics, where, page 141, the campaign is on behalf of people disadvantaged by some aspect of their situation, by being underpaid mine workers, for instance, The literary critical consequences of anti-essentialism are twofold. Firstly, there is the obvious difficulty of deciding what a lesbian or grey text is. In the list of possibilities which follow, we can take lesbian to mean lesbian or gay. The possibilities are, in a slightly reworked version of Zimmerman's formulations, that a lesbian/gay text is one which is written by a lesbian. If so, how do we determine who is a lesbian, especially if we take the anti-essentialist line just outlined? 2. One written about lesbians which might be by a heterosexual woman or man, and which would also come up against the problem of deciding what a lesbian or gay person is in non-essentialist terms. 3. One that expresses a lesbian vision which has yet to be satisfactorily described. Para. The 1 and 2 categories here seem inadequate as they stand, since merely writing about books by and or about gays is clearly not enough, since gayness is not being defined as an inherent, essential, unchanging category, but as part of a complex of other factors. A solution may be to adopt an approach which is historically specific. Thus, gayness in a novel or an author of the 1920s is not the same as in the 1980s or 1990s, and part of the critic will involve showing how this is so. On the 3 category, critics need to be aware of wider metaphorical extensions of gayness. For instance, the suggested link between lesbianism and the state of being poised on the threshold between categories. Quote, in general, lesbian critical reading proposes the blurring of boundaries between self and other, subject and object, lover and beloved as the lesbian moment in any text. Zimmerman, Lesbians Like This and That's, page 11. Thus, lesbianism is theoretically linked with notions of liminal consciousness when existing categories are in process of deconstruction. Para. Yet, this 3 category also has obvious risks, notably that gayness will probably assume too great an emblematic burden, since it will tend to be romanticized and stand as a textual emblem of resistance and disruption of all kinds. Zimmerman quotes examples from recent critical writing of this romanticizing stroke idealizing tendency. Page 142. Lesbianism is a force against rigid definitions and polar oppositions, expressed in terms of gaps, spaces, disruption, the experimental, radical disruption, introgation, and so on. This heady romantic stuff, stuff, lesbians like this and that, page 4, represents what we might call super-essentialism, since it tries to make one kind of resistance stand for all resistance and thus places a political and social burden on sexual orientation which is surely unreasonable. Para. A final and more specific literary critical consequence of anti-essentialism is a tendency to devalue literary realism, since it tends to rely upon notions of fixed identities and stable points of view. For instance, a realist novel typically has an omniscient narrator who presents and interprets the events from a fixed moral and intellectual position, a linear time sequence in which events unfold chronologically, and characters who are presented as stable essences with a personality which develops in an orderly and cumulative way. Hence, lesbian/gay criticism of the recent queer theory phase tends to favor, as do most other kinds of current critical theory texts and genres, which subvert this kind of familiar literary realism, like thrillers, comic and parodic fiction, and sexual fantasy. Thus, a novel like Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, 1985, Vintage Edition, 1991, is of interest to the lesbian or gay critic, not just because of its lesbian subject matter, but also because of its many anti-realist elements. In her 1991 introduction, the author says that the book is an experimental novel. Its interests are antilinear, and answers her own question, is Oranges an autobiographical novel? By replying, no, not at all, and yes, of course. She says, perhaps a little exaggeratedly, that the book is unlike any other novel in structure, style, and content, and deliberately makes the manner of the telling draw attention to itself by her use of, quote, a complicated narrative structure, ... a very large vocabulary and beguilingly straightforward syntax, unquote. The theme of a young girl's discovering her sexual identity is undercut with comic elements and details, and the narrative flow is interrupted with mythical and fantasy passages. As Paulina Palmer writes of these passages, quote, "The interplay of narratives which they create highlights the part which fantasy plays in the construction of the adolescent psyche and gives a more complex and multifaceted representation," page 143, than is usual in the coming-out novel, Contemporary Lesbian Writing, page 101. In a basic way, this novel and its critical treatment typify the anti-realist leanings of lesbian or gay criticism. Section: What lesbian/gay critics do. 1. Identify and establish a canon of classic lesbian gay writers whose work constitutes a distinct tradition. These are in the main 20th century writers such as, for lesbian writers in Britain, Virginia Woolf, Vita Sackville-West, Dorothy Richardson, Rosamond Lehman, and Radcliffe Hall. 2. Identify lesbian gay episodes in mainstream work and discuss them as such. For example, the relationship between Jane and Helen in Jane Eyre, rather than reading same-sex pairings in non-specific ways, for instance as symbolizing two aspects of the same character. Zimmerman. 3. Set up an extended metaphorical sense of lesbian gay so that it connotes a moment of crossing a boundary or blurring a set of categories. All such liminal moments mirror the moment of self-identification as lesbian or gay, which is necessarily an act of conscious resistance to established norms and boundaries. 4. Expose the, quote, homophobia, unquote, of mainstream literature and criticism as seen in ignoring or denigrating the homosexual aspects of the work of major canonical figures, for example by omitting overtly homosexual love lyrics from selections or discussions of the poetry of W. H. Auden, Mark Lilly. 5. Foreground homosexual aspects of mainstream literature which have previously been glossed over, for example the strongly homoerotic tenderness seen in a good deal of First World War poetry. 6. Foreground literary genres previously neglected which significantly influenced ideals of masculinity or femininity, such as the 19th century adventure stories with a British Empire setting, for example those by Rudyard Kipling and Rider Haggard, discussed by Joseph Bristow, Bristow, in Empire Boys, Routledge, 1991. Page 144, Stop and Think opens. General. The example at the end of this section is concerned with the second, fourth, and fifth of the activities listed above. It suggests that there is a sharp difference in terms of the sexual feelings involved between First and Second World War poetry. How far do you feel this to be justified? Do you agree that the former is often homoerotic while the latter seldom is? Compare two relevant anthologies in the light of this question, such as John Silkin's The Penguin Book of First World War Poetry and The Terrible Rain, see below. Para. More specific. First World War poets often use the motif of bathing with an erotic charge. Lilly quotes from Soldiers Bathing by R.D. Greenway, quote, "You strong and hairy sergeant / stretched naked to the skies," unquote. A more famous poem with the same title by F.T. Prince is often said to be the best-known poem of the Second World War. How would you discuss it in terms of the debate on war poetry summarized here? This poem is included in The Terrible Rain. Para. Corpses in First World War poems are often homoeroticized. A famous corpse poem of the Second World War is Keith Douglas's Vergis Minicht, Vergissmeinnicht, The Terrible Rain, The War Poets, 1939-1945, edited Brian Gardner, Mithuen, 1977. Illustrate and discuss some of the differences between this and 1914-18 material in the terms used in the Lily section. Section ends. Next section, lesbian gay criticism and example. As an example of this kind of criticism, we can take the chapter, quote, "The Love Poetry of the First World War," unquote, in Mark Lilly's Gay Men's Literature in the 20th Century. The essay is a straightforward survey of a range of First World War poetry from this viewpoint, drawing on poems anthologized in Martin Taylor's Lads, LADS, Love Poetry of the Trenches, and on the views put forward in its introduction. The essay begins by commenting on the intense feelings between men evident in war conditions and the general reluctance to admit the presence of homoerotic undertones or more in such relationships. The difficulty of admitting their existence is compounded by the fact, page 145, that an army in wartime is the particular expression of the most conventionally masculine aspects of a country. Quote, "A collective symbol of the controlled virility and power of the society itself," unquote. Taylor, page 65. Hence, quote, "the resistance amongst heterosexuals to the idea that men upon whom otherwise they would wish to bestow their deepest admiration might have enjoyed other men carnally," CARNALLY, unquote, page 65. At the same time, references to armies by their own side tend to emphasize the often extreme youthfulness of those involved. The jingoistic headline of the British Sun newspaper during the first Gulf War is quoted, "Our boys go in." Para. As well as the intensity of contact brought about by wartime circumstances, war poetry at the time functioned as a kind of licensed area in which it was possible to express male-to-male feelings in an unusually direct and open way. This had changed by the Second World War. Hence, expressing love for a comrade in arms, albeit usually dead, was frequent in First World War poetry, though it is difficult to know exactly what is meant by love in these poems, or exactly what kind of love is meant. Most likely the poems frequently operate on a number of different levels, with the heterosexual reader able to read this love simply as grief for the loss of a friend. This enables the poems to be printed and very widely circulated at the time without scandal. Very likely the poems operate in this multi-layered way for the writers too, since by no means all the poets were self-acknowledged gays. Hence, quote, "conventions of expression sometimes make brotherly affection, physical tenderness, and sexual desire all sound the same," page 66. If we imagine something like Reacher's lesbian continuum to have a male equivalent, especially in the horrific conditions of war, then we would emphasize that these would not each be distinct and separate states. Lilly makes this point, but in different terms, when he suggests that three commonly used terms have slightly different references, so that generalized feelings of affection and physical tenderness might be described as homoerotic, whereas feelings of specific sexual desire would be called homosexual or gay. Naturally, this will open up the field beyond those who were certainly or almost certainly gay. Page 66. Para. Lilly points out that a frequent motif in these poems is to see same-sex love as superior to men's love for women. One such poem, 146, is actually called Passing the Love of Women, and is written by Army Chaplain Studdert, Studdert Kennedy, in the persona of an ordinary soldier. Indent. Yes, I have sat in the summer twilight, with, W-I-V, a nice girl hand in hand, but I have thought even then of the shell holes where the boys of the old bat stand. I have turned to her lips for her kisses, and I have found them kisses cold, stone cold and pale like a twice told tale. What has gone all stale and old? Indent closes. Para. And the poem concludes referring to women, quote, but I knows a stronger love than theirs, / and that is the love of men, unquote. It is interesting that these poems often seem unusually explicit at several levels, for instance, about physical feelings between men and women and about the impossibility of any solace being had from religion. We might expect the poem to end, especially perhaps as it is written by a person, person, with the line, quote, and that is the love of God, unquote, but such references seem rare. This tendency towards the multi-transgression of several boundaries simultaneously lends some weight to the contention in lesbian gay studies that breaking the sexual norm is always potentially emblematic of norm breaking in general. Para. However, the poems cannot be seen as simply celebratory of socially stigmatized forms of love, since the sexual object for whom admiration is expressed in the poems is usually dead, if a named or specific individual. Where a generalized admiration for the male body is expressed, the body in question is usually that of a corpse, often an enemy corpse, it seems to me, so much so that Lily detects an element of necrophilia in this poetry. Sometimes the open expression of sexual desire is combined with necrophiliac elements, as in Harbert Reed's My Company, I, 3. Indent. A man of mine lies on the wire, and he will rot, and first his lips the worms will eat. It is not thus I would have him kissed. Page 147. But with the warm passionate lips of his comrade here. Indent closes. Gay men's literature in the 20th century, pages 78-79. Para. Hence, in order to express these homosexual feelings, the poet first ensures that there is a barrier to their fulfillment. There is no possibility of actual physical expression of these feelings because the would-be recipient is dead. The exception is that there are many poems in which the man written about is wounded. Many of these poems are gory, and Lily makes a connection with the homoerotic poems about wounds and hospitals in the American Civil War by the 19th century American poet Walt Whitman. The wound is erotically charged in First World War poetry because it allows tender physical contact between males, the war thus becoming a safe area in which feelings usually suppressed can be openly expressed, while at the same time the intensity of the circumstances means that the feelings evoked and expressed are different from those felt in more ordinary circumstances. Lily uses the parallel example of the football field, where men kiss and embrace each other passionately in public, behavior for which they could still be arrested in Britain if it were happening in the street. Para. Hence, the poems need to be placed in their context to be properly understood. After all, the army itself exploited these feelings as the start of the war with the setting up of PALs, P-A-L-S, regiments in which large numbers of men from the same district enlisted and served in units together. The intention was to draw upon networks of trust and loyalty founded on school friendships, upon feelings of class solidarity, and on local identities and allegiances. Parenthesis, the experiment was hurriedly abandoned when whole neighborhoods were plunged into mass mourning when an attack or bombardment took place. Parenthesis closes. Hence, it could be said, as Lily suggests, that this kind of poetry had official sanction since it was good for morale. Certainly, combatants' poetry had ready access to publication in newspapers, poetry journals, and school magazines. The continuum of feelings then expressed in this poetry and the varying degrees of self-knowledge and self-deceiving with which it seems to be expressed tends ultimately to deconstruct the notion of gayness as, from the heterosexual point of view, a distinct other with its own stable and separate identity. Page 148, section Selected Reading. Abe Love, Abelove, Henry, Barrel, Barale, Michelle Aina, Aina, and Halperin David, edited Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, Routledge 1993, a massive and comprehensive collection. Section 1, Chapter 2 is an extract from the influential Epistemology of the Closet. The main literary chapters are in Section 7, between the pages, including Dollimore on Wilde and Gide. Section 12, pages 662 to 665 of the invaluable Suggestions for Further Reading contain the best bibliography there is on this field up to August 1992. Bristow Joseph, edited Sexual Sameness, Textual Difference in Lesbian and Gay Writing, Routledge 1992, contains chapters on the literary representation of same-sex love in major writers such as E. M. Forster, Walt Whitman, and Sylvia Townsend Warner. Butler Judith, Undoing Gender, Routledge 2004. The book constitutes a reconsideration of her earlier view on gender performativity from gender trouble. Dollimore Jonathan, Sexual Dissidence, Dissidence, Augustine to Wilde, Freud to Foucault, Clarendon 1991. Part 3, Chapters 3 to 5 inclusive, debates the issue of essentialism touched upon in the present section. Fass, Diana E.D., Inside/Out, Lesbian Theories, Gay Theories, Routledge 1992. I found the introduction and Section 1, Chapter 1 by Judith Butler very useful, but there is otherwise little here about literature as such. Chapter 10 on Ratcliffe Hall's lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, is actually about the various covers in which the book has been issued. Hall, Donald E., Queer Theories, Palgrave Transitions Series 2003. Lily Mark E.D., Lesbian and Gay Writing, Macmillan 1990. Chapters 5, 6 and 10 are about lesbian and gay poetry, very welcome in a field otherwise dominated, like so much current theory, by writing about prose. Lily Mark, Gay Men's Literature in the 20th Century, New York University Press, 1993. An accessible book which does not presuppose wide theoretical knowledge. The first chapter is a general survey of mainstream criticism of gay writers, quote, the homophobic academy, unquote, and the rest are on major authors including Byron, Wilde, Forster, First World War poetry, Tennessee Williams, James Baldwin, Joe Orton, and Christopher Isherwood. Morland, Lane, or Ian, I-A-I-N, and Willox Annabel, edited Queer Theory, Palgrave, Readers in Cultural Criticism, Series 2004. Page 149. Munt, Sally E.D., New Lesbian Criticism, Literary and Cultural Readings, Harvester 1992. Contains useful general theoretical essays, pieces on major figures like the black lesbian poet and theorist Audre Lorde, and material on lesbian popular culture, lesbian utopian fiction, and lesbian pornography. Palmer Paulina, Contemporary Lesbian Writing, Dreams, Desire, Difference. Open University Press, 1993. Begins with a chapter outlining a range of theoretical perspectives and then has chapters on a variety of relevant genres, including political fictions, the thriller, the comic novel, and fantasy fiction. Sally, S-A-L-I-H, Sarah, Judith Butler, Routledge Critical Thinkers, 2002. Sedgwick Eve Kosowski, Between Men, English Literature and Male Homosexual Desire. Columbia University Press, 1985. This and the following book have played an important part in laying the theoretical basis of current lesbian gay criticism. Sedgwick Eve Kosowski, Epistemology of the Closet, University of California Press, 1992. Sinfield Allen, Cultural Politics, Queer Reading, Routledge 2nd edition, 2005. A lively and provocative text, a pioneering work in its field when first published. Taylor Martin Ladd's Love Poetry of the Trenches, Duckworth and Company, New Edition, 1998. An anthology of poetry with an introduction which repositions this body of work. Compare the selection and its commentary with more conventional ones, such as the Penguin Book of First World War Poetry, edited by John Silkin. Woods Grigg, A History of Gay Literature, Yale University Press, 1999. An account of gay male literature from ancient times to the present. Zimmerman Bonney, What Has Never Been, an Overview of Lesbian Feminist Criticism, reprinted in Gail Green and Coppelia Khan edited, Making a Difference, Feminist Literary Criticism, Mithuen, 1985. An influential survey of lesbian criticism up to the time of its publication and a good starting point for beginners in this field. Zimmerman Bonney, Lesbians Like This and That, Some Notes on Lesbian Criticism for the 90s, in Sally Munt, MUNT, see above. Another survey of the field written 10 years after the previous item and considering the issues and options for the 90s. Chapter 8, Marxist Criticism.